This first one was sent in to CornyDriveThru.
Yeah, I thought they were here, but suddenly they've gone.
From this one was sent in to CornyDriveThru@gmail.com from Matt Keene. Hello, Jim. It was a pleasure meeting you at the Keystone Comic-Con, and thank you so much for signing my Trump book. I wasn't able to ask a question at your show due to Bill Apter telling a long story about apartment wrestling. So hopefully
he
can answer it now.
He did. Wonderful Willie did bring up, say everybody knows the history of apartment wrestling, don't they? But it wasn't that long. It just seemed like it. But yes. So the question
Hold on. Now, Bill Apter used to have a roommate that was a female wrestler. Did he talk about if he ever tried to get her to wrestle him?
No, he wasn't in favor of it. You see, I thought you knew the history of apartment wrestling.
I didn't know Bill Apter's stance.
No, he has a wide stance from what I've heard, but that means nothing in this context. What we're saying is, no, he was against it, but Stanley Weston, the publisher, was for it. And unfortunately, every time it was Sports Review Wrestling, every time they put apartment wrestling on the cover, they sold a bunch of magazines because most of the time people buying the wrestling magazines were guys back in those days. So, but Bill was not, he was not a proponent of it, but his hands were tied. His comb over was tied.
Here's the question that we have to get to from Matt here.
Now, Matt twice said Bill Apter's apartment wrestling interrupted his.
Anyway, Matt's question. We will get to it, Matt. Were you disappointed, Jim, when you were told in 1985 that your opponents for Starrcade were going to be the Boogie Woogie Man and Ron Garvin in drag? I get that Valiant had a ton of charisma, but it doesn't seem like the best use of a team of your stature.
No, okay. I've said before that our Starrcade matches were never our greatest matches because 2 years was a scaffold. And then fucking 88 was the bloom was off the rose with Starrcade show. We had a good match with the original Midnight Express. But if you go back and look at that match, it was pretty fucking brutal because it was a street fight. Everybody got juice. I mean, Ronnie Garvin in drag was bleeding all over the place. There was blood flying. There was people's clothes being stripped off. So it was a pretty good fucking fight. But I will be lying if I said I was a big fan of Ronnie Garvin as the Miss Atlanta Lively thing, but who was I to tell Dusty Rhodes what fucking book at that point in time, right? So I kept my opinions to myself because I knew, unlike some people today, when other people knew more than I did. I would probably rather it been Ron Garvin just because the visual would have been so much better because Ronnie Garvin and Jimmy Valiant, the gimmicks aside, they had a heck of a street fight match. Like I said, with fucking chaos and the blood and the stiff shots and all that stuff. And the way that it was presented originally was Miss Atlanta Lively was because of the street people, right? That's when Big Mama went looking for Handsome Jimmy. Yeah. And I'm trying to think how it was originally presented as to it, but the deal was everybody was supposed to know it was Ronnie and that us heels were flummoxed because instead of being one of Jimmy Valiant's street people, it was Ronnie Garvin, the man with the hands of stone. And I think also because they just got a kick somehow seeing Ronnie dress up like that. I don't fucking know. I've told you, but the first day he came in to do the promos, the Barbarian from across the room didn't get a good look. And so, oh, who's the new girl? But anyway, no, with Jimmy Valiant, who was one of my idols when I was here in watching Memphis wrestling as a fan and Indianapolis wrestling as a fan and as a photographer. And was, my mother was Handsome Jimmy Jr.'s godmother. So I loved working with Jimmy Valiant. And he was so over, that made it fucking easy. Because people forget how popular Jimmy was just because now they're looking for the 4-star match, right? He'd had those 10 years beforehand with Lawler in Memphis and, wasn't making nearly as much money as he was being the Boogie Woogie Man. But Ronnie, I would have preferred to have been Ronnie Garvin himself. But as far as the match, it was probably our best actual classic Starrcade match, which is not much. There's not much competition for it because we were on the scaffold the other two times.
because we were talking about apartment house wrestling, I decided to try to find a magazine cover I recently saw, and I can't find it. It was one that talked about what happened when a rapist got into the girls' locker room, which...
Oh, yes, I remember that magazine. Yes.
I just found another one, though. Listen to a couple of these headlines. This is from Inside Wrestling, November 68. How to break into wrestling and make a fortune? Are those wild stories true, what wrestlers do after working hours? And, of course, exclusive photos of naked lady wrestlers, which I like to know how they pulled off. And then there's another story here. Quote, men love me now, says ex-fatty Bernice LaRue.
Oh, God.
And, of course, there's also a story, the assassin who didn't want to come home to dinner. I got to get this magazine and...
Well, and that's now we must say that is pre-Bill Apter, 1970. That's when Stanley Weston was succumbing to some of his more primitive urges. You can tell, ex-fatty. How far would that one get today? No, that's what Stanley Weston had, and that's why Bill had said, told a story in his book that he had to mend a few fences with a couple of the top guys because Weston was going more for the scandal gossip magazine headlines and had written a few stories a couple of guys got hot about, shit that they weren't doing, right? It was just all made up. And Bill had to go and mend the fences and try to convince Stanley Weston that it'd be better if the wrestlers were on their side and they shouldn't be quite so salacious. So then Weston made up fake girl wrestlers to be able to put those the pictures and the stories in the magazines. So Stanley Weston, ladies and gentlemen, fine. But hey, if it hadn't been for him, there wouldn't have been any newsstand wrestling magazines from the late 50s through, however long. He pretty much dominated the market.
Well, whatever he did, he made Theo Ehret a very happy man.
Yeah.
The photographer of those many. There's a great book if anyone wants to see all the old apartment house pictures mixed in with pictures from the Olympic Auditorium. It's called Exquisite Mayhem, the photos of Theo Ehret. It is spectacular. The best photography book on wrestling that's ever been released. Check it out. But we'll go to our next question here, Jim.
Until I do mine. But I'd like to see that. So send that to me for Christmas.
Oh, well, there you go. Hanukkah.